The book of Acts, to me, is very clearly fiction, and it seems to be that way for Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald as well. See, MacDonald doesn't just specialize on New Testament studies, and he's written this new book. I highly encourage you get a copy. Please help by getting a copy so that academics like him will continue to come back to MythVision. But it's such a great tool, exposing the literary imitation and the resources that would have been used. Dennis isn't just focused on New Testament studies. Dennis has training in classicist material as well, just like Richard C. Miller and other experts I like to talk to, Robin Faith Walsh, etc. And he, without a doubt, says, look, we're dealing with fiction here. Sure, there's verisimilitude, historical setting, but this is fiction. For me, if I was reading any other material in the world other than Acts, and I wasn't particularly saying this one's historical because I need my faith to be bolstered by it, and I read about miracles, just to list a few, and forgive my pronunciation in advance. Sound of rushing wind, tongues of fire, miraculous speech, lame man healed, building shaken, sudden death of Ananias and Sapphira, imprisoned apostles freed by angel, Philip transported from desert to Azotus, light and voice at Saul's conversion, Saul blinded and healed, Aeneas healed of paralysis, Dorcas restored to life, Herod's violent death, Elymas, the sorcerer blinded, cripple at Lystra healed, demons cast out of a slave girl, Paul freed from prison by earthquake, Eutychus raised from the dead, Paul unaffected by viper's bite, father of Publius healed, clusters of miracles, many wonders and signs, many signs and wonders. The shadow of Peter apparently healed some, and a multitude gathered, and they were all healed. Stephen did great wonders and signs. The multitude heeded, hearing and seeing the miracles which Philip did. The Lord granted signs and wonders to be done by their hands. Barnabas and Paul declared how many miracles, wonders God had worked through them. God worked unusual miracles by the hands of Paul, even handkerchiefs or aprons. The rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. I mean, we didn't even cover the shipwreck, which is a miraculous situation. I mean, on and on and on and on. Things that if I read in any other literature, I would be highly suspect in going, okay, it walks like a duck, talks like a duck. It's fiction. And Dennis does the same. Dennis values this material. He loves it for what it is. It's material. It's literature. It's fiction. It's great writing. It's fan fiction of Jesus, fan fiction of the apostles of Jesus. This is what you do when you want to make your guys head honchos. I didn't go into the mentioning about how Peter early on does certain things. Paul literally replicates it later. So the baton's being passed to Paul, it seems, from Peter. So there's something going on here as well. There's propaganda in this, et cetera, et cetera. And on this website that I'm reading about the miracles, this is the immediate response. It's a wrong assumption. The fact that many miracles occurred does not mean that every believer should always expect one whenever he faces a problem. God didn't always bring miraculous deliverance from danger and suffering to his children. So now they're finding a reason to say, all right, there's fantastic things you're reading in this literature. That's not always going to happen to you. So get it out of your head. Stop pretending like God's actually going to do these things that you're reading about in these accounts. Probably because these accounts are fictive. But that's out of the question for those who are literalist interpreters of these materials. They need these things to be true so that their claims are true. I would treat this like I would treat any other piece of literature. So I ask for you to stay tuned and take this ride with me and Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald throughout the whole video. I apologize in advance for the audio not being quite what it should be, but take notes. Because what we see in the internet world with the apologists, it's got to be literal, it's got to be historical, because there's verisimilitude or the we passages. All of that gets addressed here. Grab a copy of his book. The course is out. You don't want to miss it. It's the best quality course I have edited so far on MythVision's MVP course site. Dennis, I have come across many Christian apologists who have ran to the book of Acts, seen it as literal history, because it's obvious. He says, we did this and we did that. This author has to be a companion of Paul. But obviously, with your previous introduction, you would think not. You would just think not. You would go out of your way to prove not. And this book in Volume 2 actually does so much. But without getting into the book, let's have a discussion about the lead passages and see where the conversation leads. So how would you want to begin?
Well, we have at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, the author talking in the first person. It seemed good to me, O Theophilus, to write this episode, this exposition of the things that have happened to us. But then he doesn't include the I again until the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles. And at the beginning of the Gospel, he says that he is dependent on the expositions of many before him, and that includes earlier Gospels. In my view, it includes the Q document, Mark, Matthew, and a book by Papias. But we don't need to worry about that now. When he gets to the Acts of the Apostles, he still is talking about people who knew Jesus, and it's before the time of the Pauline mission. And one of the people early on in Acts that can be a transmitter of information from Antiquity would be Peter, but another is Mark, John Mark, as it's mentioned in the story, and Barnabas. And so they are heroes that have some overlap with Paul himself. But when you get to the Pauline mission, there is no source of information about Jesus that's available from these eyewitnesses. John Mark and Barnabas had gone their own way. And Luke doesn't have any sources except the Pauline letters, apparently, for the Pauline mission. So is in a way to give credibility to the narrative from that point on, chapter 16 on, which is about the beginning of the Pauline mission. The author is implying that he is accompanying Paul all the way until we get to Rome. Right. And so the shipwreck story in book 27 and the arrival in Rome is still in the first person plural, we. Now, does that mean that the author actually was a companion of Paul? Or is it a literary device to talk about the author's affinity with Paul and the Pauline mission, and adding to the excitement of the story and the vividness of the story? Now, we know that Odysseus, for 4 books of the Odyssey, books 9, 10, 11, and 12, speaks in the first person plural when he narrates his adventures to the Phaeacians. And it includes voyages. At chapter 12, he talks about how he shipwrecked and ended up on Calypso's island and so on. So we have in the tradition the we passages from the Odyssey. Now, what happens in the Aeneid? When Aeneas is shipwrecked and comes into Carthage, he narrates to Dido his sailing adventures. We left Troy and we went sailing and we had this big shipwreck problem. And he actually, before that, he talks about, and we were struggling in the Trojan War and we were trying to kill Achaeans and I lost my wife in the battle, and it's all in the wee vivid narration piece. So Luke is imitating both Homer and Virgil, and wants to create that vividness also in his narrative by saying that I was there and I saw this and so on. But a sophisticated reader would see that it's a trope. It's a part of the adventure stories that you have where the author uses this as a vehicle for being vivid.
I need to step in here just for a second. This is really good. You got a trope, vivid narrative. It's really action packed, right? There's a lot of action packed, but that alone wouldn't make it classified not under historical.
No, that's right.
Because you would go, so what? They really did this. Are there any like signs in the narrative that you would think, as someone who reads history, classic works and stuff, that goes, there are tropes? It's not just that the we thing. Like, you could find we passages that are historical. You can find we passages that are mythological. But when you're reading a story, and I've said this before, and the guy walks on water, or raises someone from the dead, or, you know, the list can go on. Some crazy thing happens, and it sounds like that doesn't sound normal at all. Like, not even remotely. I get like, hey, we were, you know, on a boat and almost wrecked, or we did wreck. That happens. But while we were on a wreck scene, I counted that God knew the numbers on the heads, not a single hair would go. And like you start getting way down into the weeds of depth into this narrative. You start going, all right, how much of this is true and how much of this is like legend? Are there any things in the we passages in Luke that make you go, here's some signs?
Well, here are signs of literary imitation is what we're after.
Okay.
And so in the Odyssey, in the Aeneid, and in Acts 27, the winds are named. The north wind is the Boreas. The Notos is the southern wind. The Zephyrus is the west wind. And the Euros is the Evros is the east wind. So we have that. We have, though, a very interesting parallel between Acts and the Odyssey. In a wee voyage, Odysseus is in his raft. He's being buffeted by the ocean, and the goddess Ino, or Leucothea, that the whited goddess, appears to him and says, "Look, you need to take my scarf around you and use it as a life preserver, but you need to abandon your ship and swim." And use this life preserver. And Odysseus didn't want to give up his ship because he spent, time building it, and it was much safer. But in the end, he had to abandon it and use the scarf and swim to the shore of Calypso's island, of the Thyakians. You have the same thing going on in the Acts of the Apostles. Paul says, I had an angel visitation at night. And he said, you're going to have to abandon the ship. And so then people are going to have to be swimming. But you will be saved, including the 200 plus people that are on board ship. And so then he tells the sailors, look, we need to abandon the ship. But we will all be saved when we get there. So that's really a distinctive trait. Here's another one. Odysseus comes to the shore of the Thyakians, and he's nude at that point. And he's cold, and he's afraid that he could be taken by wild animals. So he gathers together foliage into a kind of lean-to, and he sleeps there until the morning, and then he is found out by the Thyakian princess Nausicaa. Who then, after he bathes, she says, he looks like a god. He is so beautiful. And she falls in love with him and tries to make advances on him. So Paul, what happens when Paul ends up in Malta with these people? He gathers the wood for a fire, just as Odysseus gathers this foliage for shelter. And there's an asp in the woods, and it bites him, and it's a poison asp. And Paul shakes him off and puts him in the fire. And the Maltese said, oh my, he must be a bad prisoner because now the gods have punished him. But Paul survives it. And so what happens then? They think he's a god. So these things go on and on that way.
Real quick, I'm jacking the mic just to emphasize. So we have winds that are named. We have literally in the Acts thing, they're throwing, by the way, before they end up getting off and abandoning, they fight to not have to abandon the ship, just like him, and they're throwing off all the stuff. So I remember that detail, so there's a parallel there. Then you have him on an island, which I've always been curious of, because supposedly you'd think Paul's trying to preach to everyone. What's curiously missing in that narrative on the Lee passage, Paul never tries to convert the Malta people. He never goes out of his way to preach the gospel. And me and my buddy Stephen Nelson have been looking at this going, that's weird, because he's going synagogue to synagogue, but he goes to these archaic people out here in the middle of nowhere and doesn't preach the gospel to them, which is odd that they just leave that out.
Thought of that. Yeah.
What are some more? I know you have more in your pocket. You got
this thing about being identified as a god.
Okay.
So Nausicaa says he's so beautiful, he's like a god, and the Maltese say that he must be a god, and of course he isn't. He's, but it means he's righteous. He's not being punished.
So okay, we have the God thing now. We've multiple things here. We've clear signs that they're mimetically connecting to the Odyssey and the Aeneas, or the Aeneas. Now, the Aeneid with Aeneas. This is a huge thing. If we can see that there, if we can get someone to follow us on this journey, join us on the journey, okay? On the we can do this, okay? And you get them to see that. If it's doing that, wouldn't you take the rest of Acts and go, I see it here. Maybe this book has a lot more of this going on. Maybe I should be very suspect to did this literally happen as described?
Well, one would hope so. But that seems not to be the case in scholarship, because scholars have seen these parallels and said, oh yes, that's a sea adventure story such as we find in epic. But they haven't been very good at seeing the implications elsewhere in the Acts of the Apostles. And in my book, and in books on Acts before, I insist that major stories in the Acts of the Apostles have parallels in the Homeric epics, and they've been imitated also by Virgil. This includes the conversion of Cornelius, and it's related to the assembly of the Achaeans in Iliad Book 2. It includes the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. It includes Paul's prison break in chapter 12. Those come out of Imitations of Iliad 24. We earlier on in a broadcast, we talked about the naked young man in the Gospel of Mark being an imitation of Elpenor in the Odyssey. Virgil has two imitations of Elpenor in the Aeneid, and Eutychus, who falls out and dies and his soul is in him and so on. His name means lucky, and that's an imitation also of the story in the Odyssey. And I don't know that I want to bore you or your viewers by reading a catalog of all of these imitations, but it's all over the place. So the author is not trying to write a history that would satisfy religious fundamentalists who want to see this as a revelation and this is exactly what happened. The author is trying to idealize this story to say that the Christian narrative is more powerful and its heroes are more compassionate and wiser than you have in the ancestry of Rome. Some people call this contestation of the canonical past. And we find it in the Gospels as a contestation of the Jewish past frequently, to say that Jesus is wiser or more compassionate than Moses or David and so on. But you find it also in the Acts of the Apostles, where Luke is trying to contest the canonical past of the Greeks as articulated in Homeric epic. But he's also trying to contest the canonical past of the Romans as in the Aeneid. And by the way, you have, I don't know how much detail we want from it, so I'm going to let you ask more questions and be dialogical.
Okay, yeah. So this is really, there's so much in your noggin. And before you die, I hope we figure out a way to like download everything, and maybe your memories won't push it away, right? I know that's what this is, the book.
Yeah.
Well, I hope everybody gets this, because I know that I have some homework to do. And what I hope to do, Dennis, with this, because you're not always here with me. Well, you are, till the end of the age. But I hope to do some videos following up with this and actually diving deeper in Acts. But hearing you from the horse's mouth as someone who's an academic who sees that conservative academics, F.F. Bruce, you can probably name a couple others, who are willing to grant in we passages, by the way, which is like, whoa, are you serious? Because if you're a fundamentalist or evangelical Christian who needs the we passages to prove he is a companion of Paul, and here we have such good data to see this as a riff, if you will, off of earlier mythology, earlier poetry, okay? Then I'm looking at this going, what else is there? And we didn't get to the Ascension because that's for another video, but I just want to say, man, Jesus is the only person who ever ascended into heaven, huh?
Not a chance.
Not a chance.
Romulus, who gave his name to Rome, right, was a mythological figure. Even the Romans knew he was a mythological figure, except for some historians, Livy, I guess. But he vanished in front of his troops, and then was seen to give a vision to a senator, and was then considered to have become a god through an ascension. And the Roman emperors then also often were understood to have ascended physically into the stars or into the comet. The legend is for Julius Caesar. And when Luke is talking about the ascension, he is imitating the Romulus in Roman ascension tradition. This has been recognized by many people.
So just, I want to pause because we have so much to cover, Dennis, and we're going to do this together. I kind of want to tease people too, because there's just so much. So it's clear. We have we passages that are riffing off of earlier mythological poetry. We have ascension narratives that are riffing off of earlier mythological narratives that were well known, especially if you're competing with the Aeneid, which has Caesar Augustus, the nephew of Julius Caesar, and is in the same vein as the Romulus tales and such, which we see Suetonius do stuff like this with portents and all that. So I'm saying you have the opening of this book we call Acts, mythological. You have almost the closing, mythological riff. And then scholars are looking in between, acting like this sandwich has meat. It doesn't even have real buns. How are you going to have a sandwich? I don't understand. Now, I'm being funny. But it's like we can, what do you think it is? Why do you think that is, Dennis? What is going on in the minds of the academics that traps them from not recognizing from start to finish, there's a trope here. This is a propagandistic, I don't mean that in a bad sense, but it has been used for bad, especially when the passage is about Jews, always out to do ill against Christians. I mean, that has been used as anti-Semitism in many ways over the years. But, what are they holding on to, in your view?
Well, I think it's different for different readers. And that is, I think it's, you're more engaged with Christian fundamentalists than I am. I'm more engaged with scholars. And so I think the reluctance is somewhat different. With religious fundamentalists, it's that they have a certain standard of reading that it requires this narrative to be historically true and revealed. And the Holy Spirit would not deceive us. And so So that's a part of it. But of course, part of it also is that these people, understandably and forgivably, have not gotten PhDs in Homeric epic or in the Aeneid or in classics. So if you don't know that literature, you want to compare the text of Acts not to Homer and Virgil. You want to compare it to history. And so then you have the wrong hermeneutic. People who read the Acts of the Apostles literally do not understand what the author was trying to say. It is a misreading of the text, and it's a tragic misreading of the text. Now, on the scholarly side, I think we have some different issue. Scholars tend to be really quite painstakingly scribal when they understand the Acts of the Apostles, and they're looking for sources that may have informed the author. They're not looking for literary models. So they have a scribal understanding and not an artistic understanding of what the author's doing. So that's where mimesis comes in. Mimesis says that these authors are creative artists, and they're using antecedent literature not as sources but as models to tell stories that are similar, but it's about their heroes and not the heroes of Homer or Virgil.
Right.
But of course, biblical scholars also often have not been trained in Homer or Virgil because of a number of problems. One is Greek and Latin poetry is difficult. It's much more difficult than reading the Greek New Testament, which is hard enough, I guess. But they don't have the right hermeneutic. They don't understand how the ancients wrote creatively and dynamically. And so there's a lot of resistance to see quid pro quo model to mimesis imitations, even though we know that's what they wrote in school. We also are ignorant about syncresis, that is the comparison of one character over another to show that your character is better. And this was taught in legal education, because when you go to a law court, you want to say that your client is better than the opponent's client. And so you then get involved in this competition to show that my guy's better than yours. Well, that's what's happening in the Acts of the Apostles. Peter and Paul and Stephen are better than the antecedents in the Aeneid or in the Odyssey. So, for example, Stephen is the Christian Achilles. And you can see how the author has used the Achilles image in order to make Stephen the great Christian hero martyr. You have other examples like that. I mean, it just goes on. That's what this book is about. It's what other ones are about. But for fundamentalists to read, this is my point. To read the Gospels as history is to misread them. It is misreading the Bible and its intentions. And it's only when you see its political strategy of glorifying Jesus and the kingdom of God as rivals to the empire that you can appreciate it. And to my scholar friends, if you insist on source criticism and not mimesis criticism, you're depriving yourself of an appreciation of the author's cleverness. And this is another place where Robin Faith Walsh's business comes in, because she's arguing that these authors are elites, and they're writing for relatively elite audiences who would be able to pick up these nuances. And unfortunately, the religious world and the academic world are a little slow in accepting a mimetic interpretation.
I just want to end on one note that I think is powerful, what you said. It's almost like, here's this little club of academic smart people who wrote literature to compete with other academic smart people, who would have picked up on this and went, damn, good book, good writing, whoever the author is. Then this literature gets out. This literature escapes the ivory tower of that era. And people are reading this stuff, and they're formulating a new tradition surrounding this literature that honestly the author did not intend ever to begin with.
That's right.
So it's like if I wrote some seriously highly academic, tricky work that was well within an elite mind, and then Joe Schmo mom and pops who aren't educated at all are being read this or even being told this material, and they're reading it or understanding it, they're taking it literal, and they're missing the whole point. Someone somewhere along the way made that goof up, because the tradition goes down this path. It starts at some point being taken literal, rather than here's this wonderful epic, here's this great story, the adventures of the early Christians and their origin story. Cool! I would love this book. Just anyone would love this book. And I think we need to just come back and say, listen, we're not the ones who are stuck in sin. It's a sin to continue reading it.
That's right.
This way.
That's right. Yeah, it's a misunderstanding. Now, one of the things that's fascinating, and this is for a different time, soon after the Acts of the Apostles was written, it was not well regarded. It became well regarded in the West, Tertullian and so on. But the text of the Acts of the Apostles circulated with the Catholic epistles and was largely ignored until it was a part of the full canonical versions in codices of the New Testament. So that you have the Acts of Paul, for example, is another Acts of an apostle, Paul. It doesn't care about the Acts of the Apostles at all. It just ignores it and writes something very different. And it's possible that author recognized that the canonical Acts was a fiction. He's going to write fiction on his own. He's not going to feel obligated to reproduce the fiction of somebody else because he knows it's a fiction. So it really is fascinating.
One more thing, just a yes or no, and then we'll continue because we got to do more of these and our time's running out. This is the question. We have all of these Acts of Andrew, Acts of Paul, Acts of Peter, Acts of the Apostles, Acts of this, Acts of that, and they're all fiction. Wouldn't you think common sense would lead you in the direction you have all this fiction and now you're approaching a book we're calling the Acts of the Apostles, but it's not? Don't you see there's a genre here that's going on? And it would seem to me if I found 100 books that were Acts, I'm going to go 99 of them, nah, those aren't good true Acts. Those aren't historical. This one's historical even though it has serious red flags that it's not. Somebody's got specialty in those things. Yes or no?
Maybe. So that's not a good... Yes, you would expect that. I'm not a big fan of genre criticism because I don't think genre dictates how a book should be read as much as many scholars do. And the Acts of the Apostles actually does have more history than most of the other apocryphal Acts. So it has more of a hybrid quality to it. So there's historical stuff there that you won't find in the others. But you're right, it should make us alert that we find creative narratives about the apostles that are serving the various projects of early Christian intellectuals.
And it was astonishing what I saw. Jesus sails the sea with a crew, that is his disciples, that are not nearly as noble as he is, like Odysseus. Like Odysseus, Jesus keeps his identity a secret so his enemies can't kill him. The Jewish authorities play the role of Penelope's suitors. They love the best seats in synagogues, and they're willing to kill in order to win the inheritance. Judas plays the role of Melanthius, Jesus' turncoat slave. Jesus has his feet anointed by a woman, like Odysseus having his feet anointed by his nurse Eurycleia, and she recognizes him from his scar. And the name Eurycleia means renowned far and wide. And it said of this woman who anoints Jesus that wherever the gospel is proclaimed, it'll be in her memory. So these parallels were so striking that I dared not give a new lecture on it because it hadn't been digested. And so I spent another summer working through the Gospel of Mark, creating criteria that where I might be able to make a claim that there's a literary connection. And at point after point after point, it became clear that Mark was imitating not just the Odyssey, but also the Iliad and also some tragedian plays. And I translated Homer and Euripides and Plato for myself in order to compare the Greek of the Gospel of Mark with the Greek of these stories. And it was unbelievable what I was finding. I also turned to a study of Greek rhetoric and understood better how literary imitation or mimesis worked. And it was that people were taught how to write by imitating recognized models and to compare heroes in an activity called syncresis. Syncresis is simply a comparison to show that one character is similar but better than another. And of course, that's what's going on in Mark. Jesus is like Odysseus, but he's better than Odysseus. He's like Hector in his death, but he comes back to life. So that's a syncresis, and it goes on and on.